complete villain. If we're going to take the most sympathetic stance possible, we would say that he took power because he assumed that if he held power as a Nazi-friendly party, he could basically rule Norway as a kind of independent country under the Nazi umbrella. And Norway had done this many times in its past. It had been under Swedish occupation for 100 years, under Danish occupation for 4 centuries. Norway was definitely not the dominant power in Scandinavia for centuries and centuries, throughout the late medieval and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. So what's one more person trying to do best to weather the storm under foreign occupation in Norwegian history? Norway has a long history of this. And Quisling might have thought if Norway was going to fall to Nazi Germany's army, then it might as well be governed by Norwegians and not a foreign puppet regime. But the popular understanding of Quisling is that he was an opportunist who took power when he had the chance and began talks with Nazi Germany, where a big majority of the country supported the government in exile and fighting to regain Norway's independence. And he was just an opportunist who sought to enrich himself, to execute people like Norway's Jewish population, to subjugate his own people to misery, and to sell out his own people in the most traitorous, vile, cowardly way possible is how he's normally understood to be. What Carl mentioned is that he walked by the site of Quisling's execution, and if it weren't for a friend mentioning the site of his execution, he wouldn't have known it was there, because there was no sign, there was no memorial, there was nothing else. He's been wiped out from the record. Some people think that Quisling would have been remembered as a great man if it weren't for his treason at the end of his life. For example, in Norway, there's an author named Knut Hamsun. He's fairly well known in Europe. I don't know if he's as well known in the United States or not. I don't follow 20th century literature very closely. But he was a Nazi sympathizer. Not nearly to the degree that Quisling was, but some think that because he was a literary figure, his Nazi sympathies were mostly overlooked. During Nazi occupation, Norway wasn't treated as harshly as other places that were subjugated. It could have been that maybe Scandinavians were seen as being linked to Germans in Hitler's Aryan understanding of genetic legacy. So there were Germans who cavorted with the population. There were relationships with some German soldiers and Norwegian women. The point was that these liaisons produced children, as they did in other locations in the Netherlands and other places. When the Germans left, German women who socialized with German troops were scorned in the worst way possible. Some were dragged out to town squares and had their heads shaven and were humiliated. So if you saw a woman with shaven hair, you knew what she did. This is seen in the Band of Brothers when American troops go to the Netherlands and they witness women being scorned and having their heads shaved. It happened in France as well. So this is a legacy that appears in many different locations, and there are historians that have researched this phenomena, if it's a way for a nation to repent of itself and its deeds, and the ones who bear the brunt of this are women, even though there may have been many other parts of society that try to opportunistically make the best of a bad situation. I did an episode, I think about a year ago, about relationships with British women and German POWs who were in Britain and got married shortly after the war. In fact, there were hundreds of thousands of German POWs in the United States who helped with the harvest during World War II. And amongst German POWs and American women, there were also relationships that formed. Maybe there were women who worked as support staff at these POW camps. Some of the German men had limited ability to go out into towns. There really wasn't a possibility to escape that well. So these types of relationships are seen all over the place. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. All I'll say else with Quisling is the fact of how do you deal with being under foreign enemy occupation is not a simple fact. Some countries in Western Europe during World War II were only under occupation for a few years and then were able to throw off occupiers, such as the case of France, such as the case of Scandinavia and other places. Other countries, other nations, or groups of people were under foreign occupation for much longer. You could consider Russians who were under Mongolian occupation for centuries. From the Mongolian invasion in the early 13th century up until Ivan the Great, or Ivan the Terrible, depending on how you consider them, threw off the Golden Horde in the 16th century. Up until the 16th century, amongst the Russian nobility, they would claim themselves to be the descendants of Genghis Khan and the political successors to Genghis Khan. Other people who were under foreign occupation were almost any people in Eastern Europe. Bulgarian population, Serbian, Macedonian, Albanian were under Ottoman rule. Many disliked this, but there were many who didn't. Amongst Serbians and Bulgarians and others, many thought that Ottoman occupation was preferable to Catholic occupation because the Ottomans really didn't compel you to change your religion for the most part, as long as you paid your taxes. Whereas Habsburgs and other Catholic powers might be a little bit more heavy-handed in trying to force you to change your religion. An interesting point is a long time ago, about a year and a half ago, I interviewed the historical consultant for the Assassin's Creed games. And one of the Assassin's Creed games takes place during the reign of Selim I in the Ottoman Empire in the early 1500s. And the game imagines, what if the Byzantines were plotting to return power and overthrow the Ottomans and kick them out of Istanbul in the 1510s? I think this is a very intriguing idea, but the point I made was that, well, most former Byzantines had been co-opted into the Ottoman Empire and were now serving as administrators in the new regime. So this question of how do you deal with a foreign power is something that has been going on for a very long time, and it's not something that is as kind of clean cut as a foreign enemy comes in like the Nazis did, and then you kick them out after 3 or 4 years. All right. So let me switch gears a little bit to Benedict Arnold. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type them in and I'll get to them once I wrap up this next segment about Benedict Arnold in the next 10 or 15 minutes. And I'll do my best to address them. As you can see here, if you are watching this live, I have my freestanding cardboard wall divider and my duct tape that's holding up the side here. If you've wondered what that is, it's there. I am doing my best to describe this auditorially, so you'll have to use your imagination if that doesn't make sense to you. All right, so let me go back to Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold, if you are American, you have heard the name definitely. If you're not, well, I'll do my best to explain it. His name is a byword for treason all over popular media. You can hear this. One that sticks out to me is Revenge of the Nerds 3. Where Louis Skolnick, who is the alpha nerd amongst the nerd protagonists we've been following for 3 movies, decides that he wants to become popular, and he throws off his nerd appearance and his nerd ways. And one of the other nerds says to him, "You were the Abraham Lincoln of nerds. You were the great emancipator. Now you're the Benedict Arnold." Benedict Arnold is a byword for treason. And for a century after his death in 1801, he was the American Judas Iscariot. He betrayed his country for the basest motive of greed. He was a manifestation of corruption, arrogance, vanity, and self-interest. And there was kind of a clean moral certainty to his treachery. He was doing well, he didn't get paid enough, he switched sides, and then he died in infamy. I don't know if I would call it rehabilitation, but an alternate account of Benedict Arnold's life came about from Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis started a fashion for taking historical figures whom we thought we knew well and could cleanly explain their lives, like Leonardo da Vinci, Shakespeare, and others. And he put historical figures on the couch and psychoanalyzed them and would think to himself, well, the reason that this historical figure did this or that was due to subconscious impulses. If we look at his childhood, we can see how he was formed psychologically, and this explains why he did this or that. His id, his ego, his superego was prompting him to do this or that. Was Benedict Arnold breastfed? that can explain why he did things. That's an exaggeration of the psychoanalytical approach, but that gives you an idea of how this approach was starting to rehabilitate Benedict Arnold's. So Benedict Arnold was one of the people that maybe benefited most from this more nuanced approach to history. Freud, I don't know exactly what he said about Arnold, but maybe he was arguing that he had a Napoleon complex, he had a superiority complex, he had a difficult childhood. Because of this, he felt that he had to constantly right wrongs, and if he believed himself to be slighted, then he would lash out in the most base way possible. So when Benedict Arnold was consistently being overlooked for promotion, and the Continental Congress was overlooking him, that's why Benedict Arnold did what he did. The psychoanalytical approach produced a lot of historical biographies in the 1930s, 1940s, up to the 1970s, and it was a popular approach to history that's mostly died out. It was interesting, but also produced some weird results. There is a biography of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who was Turkey's first president in the 1920s and 1930s. Great guy. I should do an episode on him. Ataturk is fascinating. Anyway, there was a historical biography of Ataturk that approached him psychoanalytically, and it made some really weird claims. It's by Norman Itzkowitz, called Ataturk, A Psychohistory. And it claims such things as the reason that Ataturk changed the Turkish language from an Arabic script alphabet to a Latin script alphabet is because Ataturk grew up without a father, and because of his childhood abandonment issues, he resented religion, which his father represented it, so that's why he changed the alphabet. Which is one of the biggest stretches if I've ever heard one. He changed the alphabet because Turkish is more easily rendered in its current alphabet than the Arabic alphabet. I've studied it, and let me just tell you that's true. So you get into all sorts of weird explanations for why historical characters did this or that. Why did Leonardo da Vinci make all sorts of illustrations? Well, it's because he was beat up by bullies when he was in school. I don't know. I just made that up. All right, so let me go back into the historical account of Benedict Arnold just to give you some idea of what he did and some new revisionist historical accounts that are trying to rehabilitate Benedict Arnold and see if he actually is the villain that people claim him to be. So Benedict Arnold fought for the British during the American Revolution. Even worse, he did it despite growing up in the colonies and being as American as you could call someone at that time period. He attempted to use his position as a general in the Continental Army to gain control of West Point and surrender it to the British, but he was discovered for his treason before he could do so, so that attempt didn't work. But before Arnold committed his treason, he was one of the most celebrated war heroes of the American Revolution on the American side. As a child, he almost single-handedly supported his sister and alcoholic father after the death of his mother. He fought in the French-Indian War when he was 15. He grew up to be a successful businessman. So, yeah, really very prominent colonial figure. During the Revolution, he planned and led the siege of Fort Ticonderoga. During this period, his wife died, but he masterminded the strategic invasion of Quebec. He held the position for weeks despite incredibly difficult weather, his men starving and running out of supplies. He was shot in the leg, and he was cut off from the rest of his army. Before the siege of Quebec, one of Arnold's starving men recalled, "Our company was obliged to kill a dog and eat it for breakfast, and in the course of the day I killed an owl, and 2 of my messmates, and myself fared in the repast." Patriot seamen and Marines of Valcour Island were a wretched and motley crew. The refuse of every regiment, few were ever wet with salt water. He had these incredible difficulties, but he went on. He held back the British at Lake Champlain. He was instrumental in the Danbury raid. He was essential to the success of the Battle of Saratoga, which James Early and I will talk about more in our series, but the overall general-in-command, General Gage, did essentially nothing and went to retreat. Benedict Arnold roused the troops, led them into a wonderful victory, was shot in the leg, and permanently crippled for the rest of his life and had to walk on a cane. If Benedict Arnold would have died at the Battle of Saratoga, we would have schools in the United States named after him. We would probably have